Good evening, my friend. Wherever you are listening from tonight, whether your room is wrapped in the hum of rain or only the whisper of your own heartbeat, take a breath. Let the noise of the day fade away. Dim the lights. Close your eyes if you want to. And come with me into a story that was once a fairy tale, and then became something far darker. Because tonight, we're travelling back more than 5 centuries to the cold stone corridors of Westminster Palace, where a young woman named Elizabeth of York stood on the edge of history, of scandal, and of something that looked disturbingly like love. She was only 18, a princess without a crown. When the whispers began, they slipped through candlelight like ghosts, servants lowering their voices, courtiers exchanging glances, the silence that fell whenever she entered a room. People said her uncle, King Richard III, the man who had declared her a bastard and who may have murdered her little brothers, was planning to marry her, his own niece. And here is the part that makes the blood of history run cold. Elizabeth might have wanted it. That Christmas of 1484, the royal court glittered beneath torchlight. The music of lutes and viols drifted down from the galleries. Tables were heavy with gold plates, roasted swans, and the scent of clove and wine. And in the middle of it all walked Elizabeth, radiant, composed, and wearing a gown made of the same fabric, the same cut, the same shade as Queen Anne Neville's. In that age, clothing was never accidental. It was a declaration, and everyone knew what it meant. The Queen was dying. Her husband, the King, was restless, and the niece who mirrored her dress seemed to be mirroring her place. Picture it, Queen Anne coughing blood into her silk handkerchiefs, her skin pale as wax, her eyes following her husband as he looked elsewhere at the girl, whose beauty reminded him of everything he had taken from this world. A niece whose blood was royal enough to heal his fractured claim. It was obscene. And yet, it was possible. Elizabeth had already lost everything. Her father, Edward IV, was dead. Her brothers, the little princes who once chased her through the palace halls, had vanished into the tower. Her family name had been burned by politics and papal ink. She had become the ghost of her own lineage, a royal girl with no title, no power, no future. And when the world leaves you with nothing, survival begins to look a lot like ambition. The chronicles written by men called her vain, cunning, calculating, but perhaps they had never known what it meant to be a woman with no voice. In the flicker of her mirror, she might have whispered the names of her brothers Edward, Richard, wondering if their eyes still saw the world, if their small hands had reached for her in the dark. And still, every morning, she rose, braided her hair, and stepped into another day of whispers. Then came the inevitable. In the chill of March 1485, Queen Anne died. And only days later, Richard III stood before the court, denying everything, swearing before God that he had never intended to marry his niece, that the rumours were lies, but the words came too late. Scandal does not vanish, it burrows. Elizabeth was sent away, dismissed, humiliated, but her story was not over, because across the sea, in the grey rain of Brittany, another name was being whispered: Henry Tudor. He was a man born with no right to the English crown, a thin exile whose mother believed God himself had marked him for destiny. She was Margaret Beaufort, a woman whose faith was as sharp as iron, who had given birth at 13 and nearly died doing it, who wore a hair shirt beneath her silks, as if pain could make her holy. For years she prayed, plotted, and waited. And when the time came, she reached out to another mother, Elizabeth Woodville, the fallen Queen of York, and offered a bargain written in prophecy. If my son wins the crown, he will marry your daughter. And through that union, the red rose and the white shall become one. And so, On Christmas Day, 1483, Henry Tudor knelt in a foreign cathedral, lit by the trembling glow of candles, and swore before the altar that he would marry the daughter of his enemy. A promise that would bind his life to a woman he had never met. It sounded like the birth of peace. But peace, as England would learn, is only another word for sacrifice. 8 months later, the sun rose on a field called Bosworth. The ground was soaked in rain, the air thick with smoke, and two armies stood facing each other across the mist. On one side, King Richard, crown on his helmet, sword raised high, the last Plantagenet. On the other, Henry Tudor, the exile, the stranger leading an army of men who had never seen him fight. When the charge came, it was chaos. Steel, mud, screaming horses, the sky red with dawn. Richard saw Henry across the field and rode straight for him, the crown glinting, his breath like fire. He cut through Henry's guard, killing men as if they were made of paper, until the two were only yards apart. Then the Stanleys, those waiting wolves, turned. 3,000 men crashing into Richard's flank, the roar of betrayal echoing like thunder. And when it was over, the king's crown lay in a thorn bush, spattered with blood. Lord Stanley lifted it, wiped the mud away, and placed it on Henry's head. And the boy with no birthright became Henry VII, King of England. But the first thing he did was not to claim the throne through marriage, he claimed it by right of conquest. Because even now, even after the battle, he knew that the woman waiting for him across the sea, Elizabeth of York, was the one whose blood truly mattered. He would wear the crown, but her lineage would make it legitimate. And in that fragile balance between love and necessity, a new dynasty was born. When Elizabeth finally walked toward her wedding in January of 1486, snow whispered against the stone. Bells rang through the mist. The courtiers smiled. They thought they were witnessing the end of the Wars of the Roses. But for her, it was not the end of war. It was the beginning of a quieter one. That night, when the candles were snuffed out and the doors of the royal bedchamber closed, she lay beside a man. She barely knew the man who might have killed her brothers. The man who had conquered her kingdom, and England waited on the other side of the curtain, listening. Because peace, in that century, was not written in treaties. It was written in a woman's body, and so she closed her eyes, swallowed her fear, and gave England the silence it needed to heal. That is where our story begins, with a young queen who became the bridge between bloodlines, a mother whose womb built an empire, and a woman who would spend 17 years smiling through the ache of history. Now, exhale, because the night is still long, and we are only at the beginning. In the next part, we'll step behind the heavy doors of the Tudor court into the shadow of a mother who ruled through prayer and control, and the daughter-in-law she would never let breathe. The palace smelled of roses and wax, but beneath that sweetness there was something colder, sharper, like the scent of steel that had never been washed clean of blood. Elizabeth of York, bodily 19, the new Queen of England, woke each morning in rooms that did not belong to her, among servants who bowed but did not smile. And in the silence, she felt the presence of another woman stronger than any crown, the king's mother, Lady Margaret Beaufort, who ruled not from a throne but from faith, fear, and the unwavering conviction that God himself had chosen her to shape destiny. Margaret was not like other women of her age. She did not soften her power behind smiles or poetry. Her authority came dressed in prayer and penance. She wore fine velvet, but beneath it a coarse hair shirt that tore at her skin each time she moved, a reminder that her body had once been broken in the service of divine purpose. She had been 13 when she gave birth to Henry, her only child, her body so small that the act nearly killed her. The pain had carved something indestructible into her soul, and from that day onward she believed that God had bought her life at a price, that she had been spared for one purpose alone, to make her son a king and keep him there until death. Now that purpose sat fulfilled before her, breathing, crowned, married to a girl she did not choose and did not trust. In the private hours before dawn, Margaret walked the corridors of Westminster with a candle, whispering her prayers, touching the stone with her fingertips as if to bind the walls to her will. When she entered Elizabeth's chambers, she did not knock. She moved like the echo of a psalm, soft but absolute. She oversaw every servant, every letter, every gown, every meal. The new Queen's ladies in waiting were not chosen for loyalty to Elizabeth, but to Margaret. Their eyes were quiet mirrors, their tongues careful and watchful. Elizabeth quickly learned that her own words were never her own. When she spoke to a friend, that friend would bow later before the king's mother and repeat every phrase, every sigh, every hesitation. When she wrote a letter, Margaret read it first, her thin lips tightening if a phrase displeased her, her pen sometimes scratching out a word before sealing the envelope. There were rules for everything: when Elizabeth could eat, when she could pray, what colours she could wear, how long she could linger in the garden before returning to her duties. Even the hours of her sleep belonged to the older woman who believed discipline was a form of salvation. To the court, it seemed harmonious, the serene queen and the pious mother of the king. But behind the tapestries, there was tension as fragile as spun glass. Elizabeth, gentle by nature, endured it with quiet grace. Though sometimes when she was alone, she would trace the edge of her wedding ring and wonder if freedom had simply changed its disguise. She had once been imprisoned by politics. Now she was imprisoned by piety. Margaret's devotion was suffocating, and her faith had no space for another woman's will. Every morning began the same. At dawn, the bell from the chapel rang, and the Queen's chambermaids entered to dress her under Margaret's instruction. Layers of silk, brocade, fur, the air thick with incense, and the low murmur of prayers. Margaret stood nearby with her prayer book open, reciting verses as if she were warding off invisible devils. To her, this ritual was not vanity, but order, the manifestation of divine hierarchy: God above, King below, Mother beside, Queen beneath. At table, Margaret always sat close to Henry, her hand resting near his arm, her voice offering counsel, even when no one had asked. Elizabeth spoke rarely. She smiled when expected, answered softly when spoken to, and learned to speak most fluently through silence. In that silence, she studied the patterns of the court, the invisible web that Margaret had woven: priests, confessors, scribes, servants, all tied to her by gratitude or fear. When Elizabeth became pregnant for the first time, the entire kingdom celebrated. Bells tolled across London. Noble sans gift. Poets wrote verses about the unity of red and white. Yet inside the palace, the joy was not hers to command. Margaret took control with terrifying precision. She ordered the Queen into confinement early, citing superstition and scripture. She selected the midwives, all loyal to her. She dictated the temperature of the room, the herbs to be burned, the number of candles allowed to burn at night. She even chose which prayers would be recited over the unborn child. Elizabeth submitted, as every queen before her had done. But in the stillness of her chamber, beneath the tapestries depicting saints and angels, she felt like a vessel, holy perhaps, but hollow. Her body no longer belonged to her. It was the property of the crown. The future, and the faith of her mother-in-law. When the pains began, Margaret was there, rosary in hand, eyes burning with something that was not tenderness but triumph. And when the baby's first cry echoed through the chamber, the older woman fell to her knees, whispering thanks to God, not for Elizabeth's safety, but for the survival of the heir. That child was Arthur, born in the early morning hours of Winchester Castle. His name was chosen by Margaret, not Elizabeth, a deliberate invocation of legend, a symbol of rebirth for England. Henry wept with relief. Margaret crossed herself. Elizabeth smiled because it was expected of her. Yet when she held her son for the first time, she felt the faintest tremor of power. The boy was hers, her blood, her continuation, and for a fleeting moment she thought that perhaps motherhood might grant her something even Margaret could not command. But by the next morning, the baby was in the care of nurses chosen by the king's mother, and Elizabeth's hands were empty again. Days blended into seasons, seasons into years. The court glittered. England slowly healed. But within the walls of the royal household, a quiet war of women continued. Margaret's devotion hardened with age. She fasted often, punishing herself with sleepless nights on cold floors. Sometimes, when Elizabeth passed her chamber late at night, she heard murmured prayers that sounded almost like threats. The older woman was bargaining with God, pleading, demanding that her lineage remain unbroken, that her son be protected from enemies seen and unseen. To the public, Henry ruled England, but those who lived close enough to see the truth knew that Margaret ruled Henry. Her advice shaped his policies. Her whispers steered his choices. Even Elizabeth's correspondence as queen required her mother-in-law's approval. She was not allowed to meet foreign envoys alone, not even to answer letters from her own sisters without supervision. Her smiles became her armor, her silence, her rebellion. Yet something remarkable happened in the shadows of that restraint. Over time, between the forced prayers and the endless supervision, Elizabeth began to understand her jailer. She saw in Margaret a reflection of herself, twisted by devotion, another woman crushed by the world of men, surviving the only way she knew how. Margaret had used faith to carve a path through a system that despised women with ambition. She had cloaked her will in Scripture, because Scripture was the only weapon allowed to her, and now she wielded it like a sword. Sometimes, when they prayed together in the chapel, the air thick with incense, Elizabeth would glance sideways and see tears on Margaret's cheeks, real tears, raw as any mother's. In those moments, the hatred softened. They were two women who had suffered too much, sacrificed too much, and both had chosen silence over collapse. It was a fragile peace, the kind that trembles even in stillness. But it was peace nonetheless. When the second pregnancy came, Margaret repeated the same rituals, the same control, but Elizabeth no longer resisted. She had learned the rhythm of submission. She moved within it gracefully, almost invisibly. In the quiet hours, when Margaret slept and the palace was hushed, Elizabeth would write small notes to herself, tiny fragments of thoughts, prayers not to God, but to memory, because she feared that if she did not write, she would vanish. None of those scraps survive, but one can imagine her words. I am here. I breathe. I remember who I was before the crown. Outside, the kingdom saw a golden couple, the pious king, the gentle queen, the devoted mother who guided them both. But behind that polished facade, Elizabeth's world was narrow and cold. The crown was heavy, but the eyes that watched her were heavier each time she laughed too freely. Margaret would frown each time she lingered with a friend. The friend would vanish from court days later. Freedom for Elizabeth became something internal, a small secret garden she kept hidden behind her calm smile. Years passed, and children followed Margaret. Henry, Elizabeth, Mary. Some lived, some died, as all royal children did in those days. Each birth tore at her body, and each death hollowed her soul. And through it all, Margaret stood near her bedside, praying aloud, until the Queen's tears blended with the rhythm of those prayers. By the time Elizabeth was 30, she had learned the hardest lesson of queenship, that the crown is not made of gold, but of endurance. And yet, beneath the endurance, something still burned small, steady, like a candle that refused to die. In the rare moments when Henry looked at her, not as a queen, but as a woman, when his hand brushed hers and the room was empty, she felt that maybe love, in its quiet form, could still exist inside a cage. She did not love power, she loved peace. And peace, even brief and fragile, was more dangerous than any rebellion, because it taught her to hope. As the years deepened, Elizabeth and Margaret became two halves of the same story, faith and silence, iron and grace. They never called each other friends, but in the strange intimacy of shared duty, they reached a mutual understanding. Margaret began to soften. Slightly, she allowed Elizabeth small privileges, the right to oversee her children's tutors, to choose her own embroidery designs, to host her own prayers. Tiny freedoms, but to Elizabeth they were treasures. Still, the hierarchy remained unbroken. In council meetings, Margaret's chair sat beside the king's. Elizabeth's remained empty. In signatures, Margaret signed Margaret R. as if she herself were queen, and Elizabeth, smiling, allowed it, because she had long understood that fighting for power would only feed the monster. Her victory would be survival. Her legacy would be quiet endurance. Sometimes, in the evenings, when the candles burned low and the palace corridors were still, she would walk to the nursery and stand beside the cradle of her son. Little Henry. She would watch him sleep, his small chest rising and falling, and whisper promises the way her mother once whispered to her that he would grow strong, that he would never know the loneliness of his mother's heart, that perhaps, when he became king, England would finally be kind. Outside, the winter wind moaned against the towers, carrying with it the echoes of old wars and old ghosts. But within that nursery, there was warmth, the warmth of a woman who had learned to find her own light in the smallest, most fragile places, and somewhere beyond the walls, in her own chamber. Margaret Beaufort knelt on cold stone, her knees bruised, her voice steady as she prayed for her son's eternal reign. Two women, awake in the same night, bound together by the same man, the same crown, and the same silence, each believing in her own way that she was serving God. But God, as both would learn, was silent too, and so the candles burned, the prayers continued, and the cage remained, gilded and holy. That is where we leave them tonight, the Iron Mother, the quiet Queen, and the uneasy peace between them, a peace that would one day break beneath the weight of birth, blood, and the dying light of a dynasty only just begun. Sleep softly now, because in the next part, the story will move from the hush of the chapel to the darkness of the tower, where the ghosts of Elizabeth's lost brothers still whisper through the stones, and the shadow of their deaths will return to haunt the crown she wears. Night in London fell differently around the tower. The air there was heavier, slower, as though time itself hesitated to move past the memories buried beneath the stones. The wind that swept across the Thames carried a chill that smelled faintly of rust and rain, and something older still. Something that remembered the sound of children's laughter, turning to silence. Elizabeth of York had not set foot inside those walls since she was a girl. But the shadow of that place had never left her. It followed her even now, years after she had become queen, moving beside her like a memory that refused to die. Sometimes, when the palace grew quiet and the torches burned low, she would stand by the window and look east, toward that dark silhouette that haunted the skyline, and she would think of the brothers she had lost there, Edward, the boy who should have been king, and little Richard, who still haunted her dreams. The stories of their disappearance had never faded. They had only twisted over time, becoming something poisonous that clung to her name. Some said her uncle, Richard III, had killed them himself, suffocating them as they slept. Others whispered that the deed had been done by servants under his orders, their tiny bodies hidden beneath the stone stair. Still, others claimed they had escaped, smuggled out of the tower in the night, and were living somewhere across the sea, waiting for the moment to return. Elizabeth never answered those whispers. She carried them like a secret rosary, turning each rumour over and over in her mind, not out of curiosity but out of grief. It was easier to believe that they had died quickly than to imagine them alone in the dark, afraid, calling her name. She had been 17 when it happened, old enough to remember every detail, their laughter echoing down the halls, the way Edward would reach for her hand during storms, the way Richard hid behind her skirts when the courtiers bowed too low. Now their faces returned to her in flashes, half-lit, fading like the glow of candles in a draught. Even now, years into her marriage, she could not escape the ghost of that night. The kingdom called her queen, but the tower called her sister. It was Henry, her husband, who first spoke the forbidden words. They were alone in his private chamber, the fire dying low. When he said it, the princes, the sound of the word froze the air between them. He spoke of them as if they were not her brothers, but obstacles, unfinished business from another reign, the lingering stain that threatened his fragile claim. He had never met them, but he lived in their shadow. Their blood was more royal than his. Their disappearance, the dark foundation on which his throne stood. Henry's crown was built on silence, and he needed that silence to hold. Elizabeth sat very still, her fingers folded in her lap, her face as calm as marble. She did not argue, did not plead, did not let the tremor of memory show. In her heart, she knew that the same man who wore the crown might have done what her uncle had done before, made the truth disappear. Power always demanded the same price. She had seen enough of men to know that their fear of losing the crown was greater than their fear of God. After that night, she never spoke of her brothers again. But the whispers around them grew louder. Every court gossip had a theory. Every foreign envoy, a rumour. The story of the princes became the currency of England's new age, traded in shadows, shaping loyalties and fears. And then, one winter morning, a letter arrived at court, carrying a name that froze her blood. Perkin Warbeck. He claimed to be Richard, Duke of York, the younger of the two lost princes, the boy who should have died in the Tower, the boy she had mourned. He appeared first in Ireland, charming, graceful, speaking with the polished manners of the court, fluent in several tongues. He knew details of the royal family that no impostor should have known: the colour of tapestries in her father's hall, the private marks on old seals, the pet name their mother once used. The rumours spread like wildfire the lost prince had returned. Elizabeth read the reports in silence, her hands trembling slightly as she turned the parchment. Could it be true? Could her brother have survived, hidden away all these years? waiting to reclaim his birthright. For days she could not sleep. When she closed her eyes, she saw his face as a child, soft, laughing, innocent, and tried to imagine it older, harder, shaped by exile. She wanted to believe it. God help her. She wanted to believe it so badly that her heart began to ache. But faith was a dangerous thing in Henry's England. He did not share her hope. To him, Perkin Warbeck was not a miracle, but a threat. If the boy were truly her brother, then Henry's crown was built on a lie. If he was a fraud, he was still useful to Henry's enemies. Épena for rébellion, a spark that could set the whole kingdom aflame. And so, as the rumours spread, Henry's suspicion turned inward. Colder, heavier, he began to watch everyone more closely. His courtiers, his servants, even his queen. Elizabeth saw it in his eyes. The way he lingered before answering her. The way his questions came wrapped in gentleness but ended like traps. The distance between them grew, invisible but sharp. She did not defend the boy. She did not accuse him either. She simply bowed her head and said the only thing a woman could safely say, "I trust God's will." "My lord." But deep inside, where prayer and pain lived together, she wondered whether God's will had ever been anything but silence. Perkin Warbeck's claim gathered power. He was recognized by Margaret of Burgundy, Elizabeth's own aunt, who called him her nephew and funded his cause. He was welcomed by kings, armed by nobles, embraced by enemies who saw in him a weapon. He crossed borders under banners of gold and white, declaring himself the rightful heir, the son of Edward IV. He spoke of revenge, of justice, of the two brothers buried alive. When news of his growing army reached the English court, Henry's calm shattered. He ordered spies to track every whisper, every letter, every movement. He questioned servants, imprisoned suspects, doubled his guards. And through it all, Elizabeth remained quiet, her face unreadable, her heart a storm. She could not ask the question that burned inside her, what if it truly is him sometimes? Late at night, she imagined what she would say if they met. Would she recognize him? Would he know her? Would he hate her for standing beside the man who had stolen his crown? She would close her eyes and hear his voice, soft and young, calling her name the way he used to, when the storms rattled the palace windows. And when she opened her eyes, tears would be running down her face, and she would whisper into the darkness, "I'm sorry, but the kingdom was not built for sorrow. It was built for spectacle." In the summer of 1497, Warbeck was captured. He was brought to London in chains, paraded through the streets, while crowds jeered and children threw mud. He was taller than she had imagined, his eyes bright even in defeat. Henry watched from a window, his expression unreadable. Elizabeth stood beside him, her hand pressed against the cold glass. And in that moment, she felt something break inside her, a last fragile thread between the world she had lost and the world she had built. If this man was her brother, then she was witnessing the destruction of her own blood. If he was not, then she was watching an innocent die for wearing her brother's face. Henry spared him at first. He kept Warbeck at court under guard, forced him to dine with nobles, a living warning of what happened to pretenders. But captivity turned to despair, and despair to defiance. When Warbeck tried to escape, Henry seized the excuse he had been waiting for. The sentence came swiftly: death by hanging at Tyburn. Elizabeth did not attend the execution. She stayed in her chapel, kneeling until her knees blew, her eyes fixed on the crucifix above the altar. She prayed for his soul, whoever he truly was. And when the bells of London tolled that morning, marking the end of the man called Perkin Warbeck, she whispered her brothers' names again, Edward and Richard, and prayed that wherever they were, they might finally rest. But Henry's fear did not rest. That same year, he ordered the execution of another prisoner, the real Edward, Earl of Warwick, a cousin of Elizabeth's blood, locked in the Tower since he was 10 years old. He had committed no crime, except existing. Henry could not risk leaving even the faintest shadow of York alive. The axe fell, and with it the last legitimate male of her house. That night, Elizabeth did not speak a word. She sat by the fire, her hands clasped, her eyes dry. The sound of the wind outside seemed to whisper through the corridors like a child's voice fading down a stair. The Tudors were safe, they said. The War of Roses was over at last. But in her heart, Elizabeth knew that peace built on graves could never truly hold. As years passed, the Tower's shadow stretched further. Its cold stones became the measure of her life, the place where her brothers vanished, where her cousin died, where she herself would one day give birth to the child who would carry that cursed blood forward. The older she grew, the more she realized that history was not written by victors, nor by the innocent, but by survivors. And survival, she had learned, demanded silence. Sometimes, when the court gathered for feast days and Henry's mother sat beside the throne, reciting prayers of gratitude for God's mercy, Elizabeth would glance toward the great windows of Westminster and imagine that she could see, far away, the flicker of torches along the Tower walls. She would imagine two shadows standing there, side by side, small and watchful, waiting for her. And in those moments she would smile, not the smile of queens but of sisters who still remember, and whisper under her breath words no one else could hear. I did not forget you. I only survived you. The candles would gutter, the choir would rise, and England would continue to sing its hymns of peace. But the ghosts of the Tower were never gone. They lived in the blood of every child she bore, in the tremor of every heartbeat that carried the name Tudor. And that, perhaps, was her greatest sorrow, that to build the future, she had to live with the dead. The Queen would go on smiling, praying, and giving England its heirs. But behind her eyes, the shadows of the Tower flickered forever, patient and unblinking, reminding her that love and guilt can share the same heartbeat. And so the bells kept ringing, the prayers kept rising, and the world believed the roses had finally stopped bleeding. But Elizabeth of York knew better. For some wounds, even centuries cannot heal. Morning broke pale over the river, and the mist hung low across London like the breath of a restless ghost. The bells of Westminster tolled for Mass, slow and heavy, and in the private chambers of the palace, Elizabeth of York rose from her bed without a word. The servants whispered her prayers for her. She no longer bothered to speak them aloud. Her world had become ritual, each movement prescribed, each breath already decided by duty. The crown upon her head felt less like a symbol of power and more like the final link in a chain she could never remove. It had been years since the last rebellion, years since the boy who called himself her brother swung from the gallows, and still the air in the palace trembled with suspicion. Henry VII ruled England now with the precision of a man who had learned to survive by fearing everyone. He was cautious, secretive, watchful, counting his coins, counting his enemies, even counting his wife's words. His love for Elizabeth was real, perhaps, but it was a love buried beneath layers of vigilance and calculation. He trusted her smile, but not her silence. He trusted her womb more than her heart. Elizabeth understood that better than anyone. She had learned to live beside him the way one lives beside a fire, carefully, aware that warmth and destruction come from the same flame. At feasts, she sat beside him, her hands folded gracefully, her voice soft when spoken to, her laughter measured so that it never echoed too loudly. The courtiers adored her serenity, the way she seemed untouched by intrigue. But it was not serenity. It was exhaustion worn into elegance. It was survival refined into art. Outside, the kingdom appeared peaceful at last. The roses that had once bled red and white across the fields of England now bloomed together under the same sun. Trade returned. Ships arrived. Gold flowed. And the people spoke the king's name with respect. Yet beneath that calm surface, Elizabeth could feel the pulse of unease, the quiet grief of a nation that had been forced into silence. Just as she had been, the ghosts of the past walked beside her wherever she went. And sometimes she wondered if the whole kingdom was living the same life she did, surviving by pretending that the pain was over. The Queen's daily life was a choreography of obedience. She rose at dawn when the bells rang, her ladies dressing her layer by layer until she became less woman than symbol lace. Brocade, fur, jewels, and the heavy hood that hid her hair. She moved through her chambers like a shadow guided by invisible strings, bowing, praying, smiling, thanking. Even her smallest gestures were recorded by eyes loyal to Margaret Beaufort, the king's mother, who still ruled the palace through her own piety. The older woman's devotion had not softened with age. If anything, it had sharpened, cutting through Elizabeth's peace like a blade wrapped in scripture. Margaret no longer knelt beside the Queen during prayer. She knelt ahead of her, as though God himself waited for her first. Elizabeth rarely spoke against her. There was no point. She had learned long ago that defiance only built tighter walls around her. Instead, she performed the one kind of rebellion. She could still afford grace. She endured with beauty. She obeyed with dignity. And in her silence, she found a strange, aching power, the power of someone who could wound no one, but also could not be destroyed. When her mother, Elizabeth Woodville, died in quiet exile, stripped of her titles and lands, the news came to the palace as if carried by the wind. There was no public mourning, no royal proclamation. Henry had ordered discretion. It was better for politics, better for peace. Elizabeth bowed her head when she heard, then rose and continued her duties, her face serene as marble. But that night, when the candles had burned low and her ladies slept on the floor beside her bed, she wept soundlessly into her hands. The tears left no stain on the sheets, no trace of rebellion. Only she knew that the last link to her old life had gone. Her mother's death had closed the door to the world she came from. There would be no return to innocence. No one left to call her simply daughter. From that moment, the Queen belonged to England entirely. She existed for her husband, her children, and her country, though all three seemed to drain her rather than fill her. Her pregnancies came one after another, the years blurring into the rhythm of swelling belly and aching bones, of whispered prayers and stifled screams. Each birth was a public event disguised as a private agony. When she went into confinement, the rooms were sealed with curtains and candles. The air was thick, the light dim, and Margaret Beaufort always presided her rosary, clinking softly, her voice steady and firm. The first time, Elizabeth had endured the pain with hope, believing that motherhood would bring her the freedom that marriage had taken away. By the fourth child, that hope had faded into something quieter, a kind of resignation that felt almost holy. The pain was constant, the danger immense. Yet each time she survived, she thanked God not for sparing her, but for granting her another chance to serve. She understood, finally, that her body was not her own. It was a shrine to the future, a field for the planting of dynasties. In the dark hours after each birth, when the court celebrated outside her chamber and Margaret whispered endless prayers beside her bed, Elizabeth would lie still, her face turned toward the ceiling, and listen to the tiny sounds of her newborn child. The faint cries, the fragile breaths, those were the only moments when she felt alive, when she believed there might still be something pure in her life. But even that was fleeting. Before long, the infants were taken from her to be raised by nurses and tutors, and she returned to her routines, dressing, praying, smiling, surviving. Henry changed too. The victories that once gave him joy now seemed to feed his paranoia. He grew cautious, secretive, consumed by the machinery of rule. His nights were spent over ledgers and letters, his mind turning endlessly over numbers and alliances. Elizabeth would sit across from him, sewing by candlelight, her hands moving automatically as she watched him fade into shadows. Sometimes he would look up, meet her eyes, and for a heartbeat she would see the man he had once been, the exile, who had looked at her as if she were salvation. But then his gaze would shift away, swallowed by duty. There were nights when he did not come to her at all. When he did, their silence was heavier than the darkness. It was not that they had stopped caring for each other, but that caring had become something painful, something dangerous. Love in a palace like theirs could only survive if it stayed hidden beneath obedience. Still, there were moments brief, precious when the walls fell away. Once, during a winter storm, when the palace trembled with the wind, Henry came to her chamber without ceremony. He was tired, his face drawn, his eyes soft with exhaustion. He said nothing. He simply lay beside her, and for the first time in years, she felt his hand tremble as it found hers beneath the blankets. They did not speak. They did not need to. The silence between them, for that one night, was not fear, but peace. In those small mercies, Elizabeth found the strength to continue. She poured her quiet tenderness into her children, Arthur, serious and gentle; Margaret, bright and curious; Henry, fierce and restless, even as a boy. She told them stories of knights and saints, of courage and faith, but she never spoke of the tower, never of the brothers who had vanished into the dark. Some secrets were too heavy to pass down. She wanted her children to grow in light, not in the shadows that had shaped her. Years drifted by like leaves carried on a river. The Queen's beauty softened into grace. Her laughter grew rarer, but her presence remained a calm center in a kingdom that often felt like it was built on tremors. The people adored her. They saw in her the promise that the war was truly over, that England had found its gentle heart again. They could not see that their peace was built upon her silence. When Henry rode out to inspect his armies or negotiate with foreign powers, Elizabeth would walk the gardens alone. The roses there were blood red and snow white, grafted together as a symbol of unity. She would touch their petals lightly, and the thorns would pierce her fingertips. She never pulled away. Pain, she had learned, was proof that one was still alive. Sometimes, when the wind rustled through the hedges, it sounded to her like distant voices, like children laughing, like the ghosts of those who had died to make this peace possible. It was during one of these walks that she first felt the faint fluttering beneath her ribs, the sign of another child on the way. She pressed a hand to her stomach and closed her eyes. For a moment she was not a queen, not a wife, not even a mother, just a woman standing beneath a grey sky, praying for a life that would not end in loss. She did not tell anyone right away, not even Henry. For a few secret days, the knowledge belonged only to her. like a candle burning in the hollow of her heart. But secrets in a palace do not last. Soon Margaret knew, and the rituals began again. Preparations, restrictions, prayers, confinement. Elizabeth submitted without protest. Yet inside her, something had begun to shift. A quiet defiance that neither Henry nor his mother could sense. She was tired of being the vessel of history. She wanted, at last, to live as herself, even if only in thought. At night she would lie awake and imagine another world, a world where she had married for love, where her brothers still lived, where her mother sat beside her sewing baby clothes in peace. She would picture herself walking through the halls without attendants, without watchers, her hair unbound, her laughter echoing against the walls. It was a foolish dream, but it was hers, and in that dream she could finally breathe. Outside, London slept under a moon like tarnished silver, and the river murmured against its banks. The wars had ended. The kingdom was healing, and yet in the heart of its queen there remained an ache that no peace could soothe. She had given England everything: her name, her blood, her children, and in return it had taken her voice. Still, she endured, serene and luminous, the living symbol of unity, the silent center of a fragile world. And somewhere, deep within her, a quiet truth took root, that even silence can be powerful, that endurance can outlast conquest, that history remembers not only those who rule, but those who suffer beautifully. That truth would be her final inheritance to the generations that followed. For now, she rose each morning to the toll of the bells, dressed in the colours of peace, and smiled at the kingdom that could never truly know her. But the shadow of sorrow was not done with her yet. In the next years, death would return to her door, not as a whisper, but as a cry that would break even her quiet strength. The child who carried her hope, the one she called Arthur, would soon meet the same cold fate that had taken her brothers long ago. And when that day came, even the silent queen would finally be forced to scream. Winter returned with a stillness that felt unnatural, as if the world itself was holding its breath. The frost along the palace windows bloomed like white flowers, and beyond them, the gardens lay buried beneath a skin of ice. In those cold months, Elizabeth often sat by the hearth, her hands folded in her lap, watching the fire tremble, thinking of how strange it was that something so alive could die so quickly when left alone. Her eldest son, Arthur, was 15 now, tall and slender, his eyes gentle, his smile soft, his voice already carrying the gravity of kingship. He had been born to unite a kingdom torn in two, named after the ancient legend that promised renewal. And from the moment he first drew breath, all of England had looked at him and seen salvation. Yet in the quiet hours of the night, when the torches burned low, Elizabeth saw something else in him: fragility, the echo of all she had lost, a shadow that would not leave his face, no matter how brightly the sun shone upon him. Arthur was everything his father had hoped for: studious, pious, obedient, thoughtful, and everything his mother had prayed for, kind. He loved books, the sound of the Latin prayers, the poetry of history, the discipline of language. He carried himself with grace beyond his years. And yet behind his calm, there was a restlessness that Elizabeth could not name. She watched him grow into a symbol, not a boy, watched courtiers bow to him as if he were already half sacred, and she wanted to whisper to them that he was still just a child who dreamed of heroes and angels and the simple peace of walking in the gardens without guards. But queens do not whisper such things. They smile, they bless, and they watch their children become myths. The years that followed were quiet in name only. Beneath the veneer of peace, the kingdom trembled with the hidden labour of politics. Henry's ambition, once thin as hunger, had thickened into obsession. Every alliance was a calculation. Every treaty, a chess move against an invisible enemy. When he arranged the betrothal between Arthur and Catherine of Aragon, the daughter of Spain's most powerful monarchs, it was not for love, but for the weight of empires. The wedding would seal England's place in Christendom. It would bring wealth, prestige, and security. But to Elizabeth, it was another surrender, the final confirmation that even her son's heart belonged not to himself, but to the crown. Catherine arrived in the autumn of 1501. Carried across the sea by winds that smelled of salt and destiny. She was 16, pale as ivory, eyes like warm honey, voice soft and deliberate. Elizabeth greeted her with the calm dignity expected of a queen, but inside she felt a tremor she could not explain. This young girl from another land was stepping into the same labyrinth. Elizabeth had entered years before a marriage forged by politics, a future bound by duty. As Catherine curtsied before her, the queen saw not a princess, but a reflection of her own youth. The same quiet courage, the same hope that the path of obedience might one day lead to peace. The wedding took place on a cold November day in St. Paul's Cathedral. The city was ablaze with celebration. Banners of red and white fluttered above the crowd. Bells pealed across the sky. Arthur stood beside Catherine, his face pale but composed, his golden hair gleaming beneath the candles. As the vows were spoken, Elizabeth felt her heart tighten with a strange mixture of pride and foreboding. The applause that followed sounded to her like the rush of a distant tide, a sound too vast, too inevitable, to resist. That night, when the court feasted and music filled the halls, she slipped away quietly to the chapel, and prayed that her son would find gentleness in what was to come. For a brief season, it seemed her prayers were answered. Letters from Ludlow Castle spoke of harmony between the young couple, of laughter echoing through corridors, of Catherine's devotion and Arthur's kindness. The kingdom rejoiced. Even Henry smiled again. But fate, that patient hunter, was already circling them. In the spring of 1502, a strange sickness spread through the land. The sweating sickness, sudden, merciless, unlike any plague England had ever known. Men would wake healthy and die by nightfall, drenched in their own fever. Priests spoke of divine punishment, of sins unconfessed, of God reclaiming what war had spared. When the news reached the palace that the illness had reached Ludlow, Elizabeth felt the chill of prophecy in her bones. Days passed without word. Then weeks. The silence became unbearable. And then, one grey morning, a messenger arrived at Greenwich, his cloak soaked with rain, his face pale as ash. He fell to his knees before the king and queen, and the words he spoke broke the air like glass. Arthur was dead. Elizabeth did not scream at first. She simply stared, as if the sound of the words could not reach her, as if grief needed a moment to find its way into her heart. Then she rose, her body trembling, and the cry that escaped her lips was unlike anything the palace had ever heard, a sound torn between a mother and a queen. Between the living and the dead, servants rushed to her, but she pushed them away, stumbling through her chamber until she collapsed upon the floor. They said she wept until her voice was gone, until her breath came in shudders, until even her tears refused to fall. For 2 days, she shut herself in her room. No food, no light, no sound. The world outside continued, bells ringing for mass, courtiers whispering condolences, but inside her chamber, There was only stillness and the echo of her son's laughter. On the third day, Henry came to her. The king who had faced armies, rebellions, and traitors knelt beside her bed and spoke softly. His voice cracked with something she had never heard in him before, tenderness. He told her that they still had their son Henry, that they were still young enough to have more children, that England still needed her strength. And for the first time since she had met him, she saw in him not a ruler, not a husband, but a man tired, frightened, and alone. She reached for his hand and drew him close. "We must bear it together," she whispered. "For what God takes, he may yet return in another form." They stayed like that for a long time, two survivors of the same wound, holding each other in the dark, not as monarchs but as parents who had lost what no crown could replace. Outside, the bells tolled again. This time, for the soul of the boy who had been called the hope of England. The months that followed blurred into morning. The court dressed in black, the prayers never ceased, and the kingdom moved forward as it always did. Because kingdoms do not pause for heartbreak, Elizabeth moved through her duties with a calm that frightened those around her. It was as if grief had burned away every trace of fear. She smiled when she had to, blessed her people, tended to her daughters, and when she prayed, her words were no longer pleas but whispers of acceptance. Yet somewhere deep inside her, a small voice refused to be silent. It spoke in the quiet hours. When the palace slept and the candles flickered low, it told her that Arthur's death had changed everything, that the fragile peace they had built rested once again on the edge of collapse. Her remaining son, Prince Henry, was now the only thread that held the future together. He was 10 years old, bright, quick, and wild. He carried his father's sharpness and his mother's heart. But he was still a child, and the burden of an empire now rested on his small shoulders. Elizabeth watched him with both love and dread. She knew what destiny did to those it chose too early. She saw the way his tutors pressed him, the way his father's gaze lingered, calculating, already shaping him into something less human, more symbolic. She tried to shield him, to give him fragments of normal childhood, small joys, games, stories whispered before sleep. But time in a palace devours innocence quickly. Every laugh he gave her felt like borrowed light. Henry VII began to speak again of heirs, of the need for more sons, for security. Elizabeth nodded, understanding before he even asked. She was 36 now, her body worn from years of childbirth. But she agreed to try again. The physicians murmured cautions. Margaret Beaufort advised prayer, but Elizabeth said nothing. It was her duty, and duty had become her second skin. As the months passed, her belly swelled once more, and with it the old fear returned, the fear that life would demand too much from her again. She tried to pray, but her faith had grown quieter, thinner, as if God himself were weary of listening. When the labour pains began on her birthday, February 11th, 1503, the sky outside was pale and heavy with rain, the chamber filled with midwives, priests, and the watchful eyes of Margaret Beaufort, who never left her side. The birth was long and cruel, the candles guttered, the air stank of sweat and blood and burning herbs. And when at last the child came, it was a girl, tiny, frail, her cries soft as snow. They named her Catherine, after the daughter-in-law Elizabeth had barely come to know. The baby lived, but Elizabeth's strength did not return. The fever came like fire, spreading through her body, searing her from within. The doctors bled her, prayed over her, pressed cool cloths to her skin, but nothing eased the pain. For 9 days, she drifted between waking and oblivion. Sometimes, she called out Arthur's name. Sometimes her mother's. Henry sat beside her, his face pale, his crown forgotten on the table. When she could still speak, she reached for him and whispered, "Do not be afraid. The light is kind." Those were her last words. On the night of her 37th birthday, Elizabeth of York, the silent queen who had united a broken kingdom, slipped away. The bells of London rang again. Not for war this time, but for a woman whose grace had kept the realm from shattering. And somewhere beyond the mortal noise of the city, in that place where sorrow finally sleeps, a mother's voice called softly to her son, across the years of loss, telling him that love, even buried beneath duty and silence, had been real all along. Her reign ended as it had begun, not with a battle, but with a whisper, and that whisper would echo through centuries, shaping the soul of every king who followed her. The bells that tolled for Elizabeth's death rang for hours, their sound carrying through the mist that hung over the Thames, dull and unending, like a wound that refused to close. Across London, candles burned in windows, merchants bowed their heads in silence, and peasants paused in the fields to cross themselves. The queen who had united red and white, who had turned a marriage of strategy into a symbol of peace, was gone. Yet inside the walls of Richmond Palace, the air was still and suffocating. Curtain drawn, corridors dimmed. Laughter vanished, as if light itself had been banished. The king did not speak. He did not eat. He did not pray. He shut himself away in his chamber for days, refusing to see anyone. His servants left, kneeling outside the door, waiting for orders that never came. Henry VII, the man who had conquered kingdoms, outwitted conspiracies, and built an empire from exile, that was reduced to a silence so profound that even the courtiers who feared him began to pity him. They said he was haunted, that the ghost of Elizabeth walked the halls at night, her footsteps soft on the stone, her perfume lingering in the cold air. Some swore they heard him speak to her in the dark, calling her name, promising things he had never said in life. Others claimed he sat by her empty bed each evening, staring at the place where she used to rest her hand. The same man who had once been too cautious to love openly, now drowned in the love he had been too afraid to show. But kings are not allowed the luxury of grief. The realm demanded movement, and the council demanded presence. On the 10th day after her death, they forced the doors open. Henry emerged pale and thin, his face hollow, his eyes sunken and rimmed with red. He looked not like a king, but like a ghost wearing a crown. He nodded to his advisors, spoke briefly of taxes and treaties, but his voice was faint, as if spoken through water. Then he left the hall and returned to the chapel where her coffin lay. It was said that when he saw her body sealed in lead, he pressed his hand against the cold metal and whispered, "You were the peace I never deserved." The funeral was magnificent, as befit a queen who had birthed a dynasty. The streets of London filled with mourners. The bells of Westminster Abbey tolled as her coffin passed beneath the archways draped in black silk. Henry followed on foot, bareheaded in the rain, his cloak soaked through, his face turned toward the ground. The people had never seen him so human. They'd always known him as cautious, hard, impenetrable. Now they saw a man undone. When the coffin was lowered into the vault beneath the Lady Chapel, the sound of the ropes creaking seemed to tear through him. He bowed his head, and for a moment he swayed as if the weight of his own crown had become unbearable. After her burial, the king changed. Something inside him hardened, and something else withered away. The warmth that Elizabeth had brought into the court vanished with her. The laughter of children, The music, the small feasts, the gentle light that once softened the sharpness of power, all gone. The palace became a place of whispers and accounts, ruled by parchment and coin. Henry no longer dined with his courtiers. He no longer watched the musicians or the masks that had once delighted Elizabeth. He buried himself in the treasury, counting gold as though each coin could fill the emptiness she had left behind. He had always been prudent, but now he became obsessed. The king's fear of loss turned to hunger. Hunger for wealth, for control, for order. He taxed the nobles harshly, punished corruption with cruelty, demanded tributes from even the smallest towns. His councillors, Richard Empson and Edmund Dudley, became infamous for their ruthless efficiency, wringing coin from every corner of the realm. The people began to mutter that the king's heart had turned to stone, that he was building a fortress of gold to protect himself from the ghosts that haunted him. Yet those who saw him alone knew that the fortress was hollow. Late at night, he would walk the halls, his hand brushing the tapestries as if searching for her shadow. There were moments, fleeting and fragile, when the old Henry appeared, the cautious father, the weary husband. He visited their children more often, though his presence frightened them. Little Mary, with her mother's gentleness, would take his hand and ask when the Queen was coming back. He would only shake his head and whisper, "She has gone to God." The boy Henry, now 11, stared at him in silence, his jaw set, his eyes already burning with a fire too bright for his years. The king looked at his son and saw not comfort, but warning. That child, he knew, carried both the crown's glory and its curse. When winter passed and spring returned, the court urged Henry to remarry. It was a practical matter. They said England needed alliances, sons, stability. The king listened without expression. Envoys came from across Europe with portraits of princesses and proposals written in careful Latin. He examined them one by one and set them aside. None of them resembled her. None of them had her eyes. None of them could have replaced the stillness she had brought to his restless heart. He considered marriage to Joanna of Castile, Catherine's widowed sister. But even that negotiation felt hollow. It was politics, not desire. He knew it, and so did everyone else. He grew older quickly in those years. His hair turned white. His body stooped. His hands trembled when he wrote. He began to speak less, eat less, laugh never. Even the loyal servants who had followed him since exile whispered that he had aged 10 years in 2. Some nights, they said, he sat before Elizabeth's tomb in Westminster, speaking softly to her effigy as if it could hear him. "You were the calm in the storm," he once murmured. "Now I am only the wind." England, meanwhile, prospered on the surface. Trade flourished. Roads were repaired. Peace held. But peace bought through fear breeds silence, not happiness. The people loved their dead queen more than their living king. They remembered her smile, her gentleness, the way she touched children's heads in the crowd, the way she bowed her head in prayer beside the poor. In taverns and marketplaces, her name was spoken with reverence, Henry's with caution. He had become a shadow of his own reign, a man clinging to order because chaos meant remembering her absence. When plague struck London in 1508, Henry fled the city to Richmond, the same place where she had died. He claimed it was precaution, but the truth was simpler. He wanted to be near her. The air there was damp and heavy, the river moving sluggishly under the bridge, the gardens overgrown. He spent his last months in that half-silence, the windows closed, the fire always burning low. His health began to fail. The doctors bled him, prayed over him, mixed their tonics of herbs and honey. But nothing helped. The fevers came in waves. At night he shivered under blankets, his breath shallow, his mind wandering between present and memory. Sometimes he spoke her name. Sometimes he reached toward the air, as if to touch a face no one else could see. He summoned his confessor and demanded that his body be buried beside hers. No separate tombs. No grandeur, just one vault, one resting place. She united England. He said, and she shall unite us in death. The monks who recorded his final words wrote that he wept as he spoke them, his tears cutting clean lines through the sweat on his face. He lingered for days, between life and whatever comes after, drifting in and out of consciousness. On April 21st, 1509, as the dawn broke over the misty river, Henry VII took his last breath. Those who were there said that he smiled at the end, and that the room seemed, for a moment, filled with warmth, as if a long-awaited peace had finally entered. When they opened the vault in Westminster, they found her coffin untouched, the lid unblemished, despite the passing years. The king's body was placed beside hers, their hands clasped in bronze above the tomb. The sculptor, Pietro Torrigiano, captured them not as conquerors, but as pilgrims, eyes closed, faces serene, united at last in the silence they had shared for so long in life. The marble gleamed in the candlelight, and those who saw it swore that the Queen's effigy seemed to smile, faintly, as though she had been waiting for him. And so the story of Henry and Elizabeth ended not in grandeur, but in stillness. The two who had begun as enemies, their families drenched in generations of blood, lay side by side, their bodies turned toward heaven, their legacy sealed in stone. The dynasty they had forged from grief and endurance would rise and fall in ways neither of them could have imagined. Their son would become Henry VIII, the king of 6 wives, of broken churches, of a nation torn again between faith and desire. Their granddaughter would become Elizabeth I, the Virgin Queen, the woman who carried her grandmother's name and her quiet strength but wielded it like a sword. But for now, in that dim chapel, the world was still. The wars were over. The candles flickered. The bells of Westminster tolled not for battle but for rest. And beneath the marble effigies, in the silence between breath and eternity, perhaps the king who could not mourn and the queen who had learned to endure finally found the peace that had eluded them in life. The kind of peace that is not granted by crowns, nor written in history, but whispered in the language of the soul. The story of Henry and Elizabeth had begun in war and ended in prayer. And somewhere beyond the mortal world, where duty no longer separates love from sorrow, 2 souls that had carried the weight of a nation could, at last, simply sleep. The candles burned low in Westminster Abbey, the wax pooling at the base of the marble effigies, where 2 figures lay carved in eternal stillness, side by side. The Queen with her folded hands and the faintest smile of resignation, the King with his stern, weary face softened at last by rest. Outside, London moved on as it always had, the river breathing mist, the bells echoing across rooftops, merchants shouting through the fog. But inside that sacred chamber, time seemed to stand still. The dynasty they had forged in pain and silence had outlived them both, and yet the seeds of everything that would one day destroy it were already sown. Henry VIII was only 17 when the crown was placed upon his head, and the people cheered as though the sun had returned after a long night. He was tall, handsome, golden, the very image of his mother's grace and his father's strength. His smile dazzled the court. His laughter filled the halls that had known too much mourning. England had been ruled by silence for too long, and now it found itself ruled by sound music. feasts, trumpets, the clatter of armor, the echo of youth, unafraid of consequence. Yet beneath the glittering spectacle of his reign, the ghosts of his parents lingered. Henry carried both their blood and their burdens, the fear of his father and the yearning of his mother, and those two forces would one day devour him. In the first years of his rule, he sought to undo the heaviness that had defined the court of Henry VII. He tore open the windows of the palaces, flooded the rooms with light, gave jewels to his courtiers, gold to his favorites, laughter to his people. He wanted to be everything. His father was not generous instead of cautious, magnificent instead of secretive, passionate instead of restrained. Yet in trying to escape his father's shadow, he was already repeating his father's curse, the need to control what he feared might slip away. Elizabeth of York had raised him with tenderness, whispering stories to him in the quiet hours before sleep, stories of knights and saints, of courage and patience. She had taught him to believe that gentleness was strength, and that love was a kind of power. But he had also seen the way her gentleness was caged, how her obedience had been mistaken for peace. Somewhere deep within him, something twisted that lesson into its opposite. He learned that love was dangerous unless it was conquered, that peace was fragile unless enforced, that women could be adored but never trusted with freedom. And so the boy who once clung to his mother's skirts grew into a man who would destroy every woman who reminded him of her. Catherine of Aragon became his first queen, the Spanish bride once meant for his brother Arthur. Their marriage began in harmony, two young monarchs united by faith, by duty, by the shared ghosts of their losses. Henry loved her sincerely in the beginning. She was wise, devout, and gentle. But as years passed, and no living son came from her womb, the old paranoia that had poisoned his father began to seep into him. He saw omens in her miscarriages, betrayal in her prayers, and each failure to produce an heir felt like the echo of that ancient Tudor fear that God might revoke the crown he had only recently granted. It was then, in the dim corridors of the palace, that Henry began to dream of his mother, not as the warm figure who had sung him to sleep, but as the quiet shadow who had died giving life. He saw her face pale and still, heard the sound of bells ringing for her death, and woke each time drenched in sweat. He told no one of these dreams, but they haunted him. Somewhere within them, he began to believe that his mother had died because she was too kind, too yielding, too silent, and he vowed, consciously or not, that he would never allow any woman that much power over him again. The ghosts of Elizabeth and Henry VII shaped his court like invisible architects. From his father, he inherited suspicion. From his mother, a longing that could never be satisfied. His reign became a theatre of contradictions, love and cruelty, faith and defiance, brilliance and blood. The same king who wrote hymns to God would order executions before breakfast. The same man who loved music and poetry would destroy monasteries and burn scholars alive. He was his parents, fused together his father's cold pragmatism, wrapped in his mother's wounded heart. When Catherine failed to bear a son, he turned his eyes to Anne Boleyn, the woman whose laughter carried the spark of rebellion. She was unlike any queen England had ever seen. Clever, fearless, alive with fire. In her, Henry saw both danger and salvation. She awakened something in him. He did not understand the need to dominate not just through conquest but through desire. And so he destroyed 1,000 years of faith for her, broke with Rome, defied the Pope, and named himself the head of the Church, all for love, or what he believed love to be. But love, for Henry, was never about devotion. It was about control. It was about undoing the silence of his childhood, the quiet grief that had filled the palace after his mother's death. He needed sound applause. Confession. Surrender. And when Anne's brilliance began to threaten him, when her words cut too close to truth, he silenced her too. The axe fell at Tower Green, and the people who had once cheered him now whispered of the queen whose eyes had met the sky before death. Through each wife that followed Jane, Anne, Catherine, another Catherine Henry repeated the same pattern of longing and destruction. Each woman became a mirror in which he sought the reflection of the mother he had lost, the peace he had never known, the forgiveness he could never give himself. Each time he believed he had found her again, each time he destroyed her. The dynasty that Elizabeth had held together with prayer and restraint now shook under her son's passion. The peace she had bought with silence was consumed by his roar. And yet, in a strange and terrible way, she lived on through him. The gentleness she had embodied became the dream he chased and could never reach. Her endurance became the measure of his failure. The more he tried to escape her, the more he became bound to her ghost, even in his final years. When his body was bloated and his heart failing, Henry kept her memory close. In his private chambers, he kept a small locket with her image, a portrait painted before her death. He would sometimes open it, gaze at it for long minutes, and say nothing. Perhaps he saw there the last trace of innocence in his life. Perhaps he saw the woman whose love had been unconditional, whose silence had been the only truth he ever trusted. Or perhaps he saw only what he had inherited, and could never change the burden of a heart that could rule a kingdom but never rule itself. Outside the palace walls, England had become unrecognizable. The monasteries burned, their gold melted, their books scattered. The fields were filled with beggars, their songs replaced by the clang of hammers forging a new world. Yet through all that noise, the shadow of his mother lingered. In the hush of the chapel before dawn, in the sound of the choir boys' voices, in the flicker of candlelight across the carved marble of Westminster, she was still there. Elizabeth of York, the woman whose gentleness had outlived her body, whose silence had become a kingdom's conscience. When Henry VIII finally died, in 1547, they buried him beside Jane Seymour, the one wife who had given him a son. Yet even as the stone sealed his tomb, some said his spirit wandered to the Lady Chapel, to the place where his parents lay. They said that on quiet nights, when the abbey was empty, a faint sound could be heard, the echo of footsteps, the murmur of a man's voice, the whisper of a woman's laughter answering him. Perhaps it was only the wind. Or perhaps, after all the noise, after all the blood, the son had finally found his way back to the mother whose silence had begun it all. And so the Tudor rose remained, its petals red and white, its roots deep in both love and sorrow. It bloomed for a century, bright and terrible, until it, too, faded into history. But beneath the layers of conquest and faith, beneath the crowns and betrayals and reforms, there still beats the quiet heart of the woman who endured in silence, who turned war into peace, who gave life to both the glory and the ruin that followed. For every dynasty built on power must one day remember the price of its beginning, and every echo of triumph carries within it the memory of a whisper. The whisper of a queen who once looked at a man across a candlelit hall and thought, perhaps peace is possible after all. A whisper that became a kingdom, a whisper that became history. And when the night falls over Westminster, when the wind moves through the arches and the river murmurs beyond the walls, that whisper still lingers soft, eternal, unseen, reminding the world that even in the silence of the dead, love can still be heard. Centuries pass, yet the air within Westminster never fully changes. The dust settles but never sleeps. and the sound of footsteps seems to echo not only from the living, but also from the ghosts that never left. There, beneath marble and gold, beneath prayers spoken in languages long dead, lie Henry and Elizabeth, the first of their name, bound together in a union that ended a war, but began a dynasty drenched in contradiction. Above their tomb, the candles burn low, and the light trembles against the carved petals of the Tudor, rose red for Lancaster, white for York. One bloom, born of suffering and sacrifice. It is said that when the wind moves through the chapel at night, the flames bend toward the vault, as if bowing to the memory of the woman who gave England both its peace and its sorrow. Time did not forget them, though it tried. Generations came and went. The crown passed from one restless hand to another. But always, in the hush before dawn, there remained that echo, the soft breath of a queen whose silence shaped everything that followed. From Elizabeth's womb had sprung not just a line of kings and queens, but the story of England itself, glory and ruin intertwined, faith and betrayal written in equal measure. And though her name was spoken less often as the years turned, it lived still in the faces of her descendants, in the fire of their eyes, in the quiet endurance that outlasted every tempest. When Henry VIII's daughter Elizabeth I came to rule, the world whispered that the spirit of her grandmother had returned, not in body, but in will. The new Elizabeth stood before her court radiant and alone, her hair catching the light like burnished copper, her eyes steady and distant, her voice carrying both gentleness and command. She called herself the Virgin Queen, belonging to no man, yet her strength was born of every woman who had come before her, every silence endured, every wound concealed beneath the stillness of a crown. The courtiers saw a goddess, the poets saw an immortal, but those who looked deeper saw the shadow of the first Elizabeth, the girl who had once bowed her head before her uncle, who had once smiled through fear, who had once given her life to a realm that took more than it ever returned. The lineage that began in blood ended in brilliance. Under Elizabeth I, England found its golden age, the seas conquered, the arts reborn, the nation united beneath a single image of power. Yet even in that triumph, there was loneliness. The Virgin Queen ruled surrounded by admirers, but untouched by love. Her throne, a fortress and a prison both. Perhaps she understood too well the legacy of her grandmother. How love can cost a kingdom, how devotion can turn to duty, and duty to death. So she chose solitude, not as surrender, but as control, as if by denying herself the bonds that had broken her ancestors, she could finally free their ghosts. Still, history has a way of repeating itself in whispers rather than shouts. The Tudor line, so carefully built, so fiercely protected, ended with her. No heirs, no sons, no daughters, only memory. The rose that had once bloomed so brightly began to fade, its petals falling one by one into the pages of history. When Elizabeth I died, she was buried not far from the grandmother whose name she carried. Two Elizabeths, two mirrors, two ends of a single thread. The first who gave life to the Tudor dream, and the last who watched it die. Between them stretched a century of passion, power, and pain, as if all the joy and all the ruin of England had been distilled into one family's fragile heart. But death is never an ending in such places. Even as new dynasties rose and fell, as the Stuarts and Hanoverians took their turns upon the throne, pilgrims continued to visit that chapel where the first Tudor queen slept. They came not for the grandeur of kings, but for the quiet presence of a woman whose life had been carved from duty and sacrifice. They would stand before the marble effigies and feel something stir inside them, not awe, but tenderness. For in that stillness, There was truth that history's greatest victories are often born of endurance, not glory. The monks who tended the tomb said that sometimes, on the anniversary of her death, the air grew sweet with the scent of roses, though no flowers were placed there. They said they heard the faint sound of a woman's breath, as if she sighed softly through the stone, a sigh that held neither sorrow nor joy, but the peace of one who had carried both and learned to let them go. Perhaps it was imagination, or perhaps the spirit of Elizabeth still lingered, watching over the realm she had mended with her silence. And if she could have seen the centuries that followed the wars, the revolutions, the endless march of time, she might have smiled her quiet smile and whispered what she had always known, that no crown is eternal, that peace is only ever borrowed, that love, even when buried, continues to shape the living. The poets who wrote of her did not always understand her. They spoke of beauty, of grace, of queenship, but rarely of the woman behind those things, the heart that beat softly beneath layers of velvet and gold, the eyes that saw too much and spoke too little, the soul that learned to survive in a world where tenderness was mistaken for weakness. Yet it was her tenderness that saved a kingdom, her calm that ended generations of slaughter. Without her, there would have been no dynasty at all, no golden age, no England as the world came to know it. In that way, her story outlived her name. Every monarch who followed, from the Tudors to the Windsors, from palaces of candlelight to corridors of glass, and cameras carried something of her within them, whether they knew it or not. The restraint behind the speeches, the grace behind the smile, the quiet behind the ceremony, all were echoes of the woman who once stood alone beneath the weight of two roses and chose to unite them. And so, in the endless turning of time, her legacy endures not as thunder but as breath. The church bells still ring, the river still moves, the city still dreams. And somewhere beneath its stones, the queen who began it all lies beside the man who once was her conqueror, now her companion in the peace they both spent their lives seeking. The marble above them glows in candlelight, the carved roses curl into eternity, and the silence that once caged her has become her freedom. If you listen closely, you can almost hear her voice faint as the rustle of a page, soft as a prayer, reminding us that kingdoms rise and fall, but love, in its truest form, survives them all. The world may have forgotten her words, but not her stillness. It lives in the hush before every coronation, in the pause between two tolling bells, in the breath that England takes before naming its next ruler. For every crown that touches a human head carries her invisible blessing, her quiet warning that peace is a fragile miracle, and that no power, no glory, no empire can outlast the heart that bore it first. So when the night falls over the Thames and the wind sighs against the stones of Westminster, remember her not as a queen, not as a symbol, but as a woman who carried the weight of a world on her shoulders and did not let it break her. She was the first Elizabeth, the silent bridge between war and peace, between the dying age of chivalry and the dawning of a nation's soul. The last rose of England still blooms in her name, and though centuries have buried her voice, its echo remains soft, steadfast, eternal, whispering through time that love and sorrow, when joined, become history's truest crown. There are nights in London when the rain falls so quietly it feels like memory itself descending from the sky, when the river glimmers with the reflection of lamps that look almost like the souls of the dead keeping watch. On such nights, if you walk past Westminster, you can still sense it, that pulse beneath the stone, that slow, steady heartbeat of centuries, refusing to fade. The air is thick with stories, and among them none hums louder than the one of the Queen who saved England, by enduring it. Elizabeth of York, the woman of silence, the mother of peace, the soul that bound the red and the white and gave birth to a line that would change the world. Inside the abbey, time feels like a held breath. The marble effigies lie under their canopy of gold, their faces serene, their eyes closed, their hands joined in eternal prayer. The flicker of candlelight plays across the folds of their sculpted robes, as though the stone itself is breathing. Tourists and mourners pass by, their footsteps echoing in reverence, their whispers soft. But every now and then, the silence deepens, and something else seems to move, not a sound, but a feeling, a warmth, almost human, lingering just long enough to make the living turn their heads. It is said that those who stand long enough before her tomb will feel a strange calm descend upon them, a stillness that feels like absolution. 500 years have passed since Elizabeth's death, and yet her presence has never truly left the realm. History remembers her not through speeches or decrees, for she left no words behind, but through what she carried wordlessly, the quiet strength that turned grief into grace. Every crown that came after hers carried a trace of her restraint. Every queen who ruled after her echoed her endurance. Her name has become less a name than a melody. Fin, but, unending. A note that hums beneath the grand chorus of England's history. But what does peace truly mean to those who died, making it what remains of love once it has been sanctified by death? The answers hide between the cracks of time, between the lines of the chroniclers who wrote about kings and wars and forgot that behind every crown there was a woman praying through the night, holding a kingdom together by the sheer will of her heart. Elizabeth's peace was not the peace of triumph, it was the peace of surrender, of choosing to stay when running would have been easier, of healing a world that had taught her only how to bleed, even in her stillness. She lived through all who came after. Her son Henry ruled with fire, her granddaughter Elizabeth with light, but both drew unknowingly from the same well, the quiet strength of a mother who had endured too much to believe in glory. The wars she ended with her marriage flared again in different forms. Faith against faith, heart against heart, until England itself seemed trapped in the same eternal rhythm of love and ruin. Yet even as history repeated its cruelty, the memory of her gentleness remained like the faint scent of roses after rain, the proof that kindness, though easily forgotten, never truly dies. The abbey's great clock chimes the hour, and the sound drifts up through the arches like a prayer for the restless dead. The night guard passes, his footsteps muffled by stone, and for a moment the chapel is empty. The candles gutter in their holders, their flames bending toward the tomb, and the light catches the curve of her sculpted face. She seems almost alive, her marble features soft beneath the shadow, her expression neither joy nor sorrow, but something beyond both understanding. In that frozen moment of eternal rest, she is no longer a queen, no longer a wife or a mother or a saint. She is simply what she always was beneath all the crowns and vows, a woman who loved, who lost, who forgave. Outside, for the world she left behind keeps spinning. Cities rise and crumble. Wars roar and fade. Empires stretch and collapse. The England she once gave her life to is no longer the same. The language has changed. The people have changed. Even the faith has shifted. But still, her name whispers through its veins. In every act of mercy, in every quiet strength, in every woman who endures without recognition, she lives again. Her silence has become a lesson louder than any sermon that power need not shout to be eternal. That the truest victory is to remain whole after the world has tried to break you. And perhaps that is why her story still lingers. Why those who read it centuries later feel not distance, but kinship. Because her life is not only the tale of kings and crowns, but of every heart that has loved beyond reason, every soul that has chosen forgiveness over vengeance, every person who has stood before the darkness and whispered, "I will not disappear." She is the quiet courage inside every broken lineage, the pulse beneath every peace treaty, the unseen hand that holds the world steady while it trembles. As dawn begins to rise above the Thames, the first light filters through the stained glass of the abbey, painting the tomb in hues of crimson and white. For a fleeting instant, the carved roses on the vault seem to bloom anew, their colours alive again in the sunlight, red for passion, white for grace, bound together by the stone that time cannot erode. The centuries blur, and it feels as though she is still there, standing beside the river, watching her children's children rule, watching her country endure. If ghosts dream, then surely hers dreams of peace, not the fragile peace of treaties, but the eternal peace of being remembered with tenderness. She has no need for monuments or crowns, for her kingdom is the memory she left behind, the example of how love can survive in a world made of war. And when the candles finally burn out, when even the marble effigies have faded, her spirit will remain in the breath of the river, in the hush before the bells, in the murmur of every prayer said for those who endured quietly. She will remain in the stillness that comes after grief. The small, miraculous silence. That means life continues. Elizabeth of York, the queen who united a country not by conquest but by compassion, who gave her voice to history through silence, who built a dynasty with her body and healed a nation with her heart. Her story began in fear and ended in grace. And across half a millennium, her peace still touches the world like a whisper against the soul. For when the candles go out and the world grows still, it is her light that remains unseen, unspoken, but everlasting. The rose she planted still blooms beneath England's sky, its petals red and white, its roots deep in both love and loss. And as long as that rose endures, so will she, the first Elizabeth, the mother of peace, the quiet heart of a kingdom that learnt, through her, that silence can outlive even the loudest crown.